of homes. A man loved a woman, a child it was born. It learned how to hurt, and it learned how to cry, like humans do.
Hi, I'm Tommy Rocket, and welcome to the 197th Tommy Rocket Show. We're here today with Peter Phipps. Peter is my co-host and the plenipotentiary of the Tommy Rocket Show. We have Executive Director of Save the Bay with us today, Jonathan Stone. Welcome, and thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for having me here.
Peter, I see you have a great outline for this show and hot topic.
So we're going to do 50 years back and 50 years forward.
Okay, sounds good.
And just a point of interest, we were going to do this on your 50th anniversary, but COVID intervened here. But
Yes.
the past is still the past, and it is what it is. So let's take us back to the early 70s. And from what I've read, I didn't live here at the time, the Bay was a poisonous, horrific mess a lot of the year. So tell us about what Save the Bay found that it needed to address.
Well, maybe the place to start is actually in the 1960s, when there was a greater awareness of pollution and damage to the environment. And a group of citizens, interestingly, on Jamestown, started to become involved in a fight to prevent an oil company from building an oil refinery on Canna Island in Jamestown. And a few years later, another oil company proposed building an oil refinery in Tiverton, right by the Boathouse restaurant in Tiverton, where there's a condominium complex now. And the first group succeeded in the battle against a major oil company and successfully defeated the building of that oil refinery in Jamestown. And the group in Tiverton, 4 or 5 years later, succeeded in defeating that oil refinery and realized, as they were victorious, that there would be more big, ugly energy projects on Narragansett Bay, and that wouldn't it make sense, instead of disbanding and then reforming and disbanding, wouldn't it make sense to start an organization to protect Narragansett Bay from big energy projects? So the two groups got together and they started Save the Bay. They formed Save the Bay.
So the Save the Bay, if we were 50 years ago, you might think, save the Bay from giant oil refineries.
Yeah.
Not as we do today, save the Bay from
Pollution,
right.
Now, they all realized, and by the way, I should mention that the founding members of Save the Bay were from all walks of life. They were fishermen, they were sailors, they were people who liked to just walk along the shore. They really were quite diverse in their interests in the Bay. They had different ways of connecting with the Bay, but they saw this need to create this organization and need to build some capacity, both to fight energy projects, but also to deal with pollution, which was a huge problem also at the same time. So the organization's mission quickly grew to not only defend against big, ugly energy projects, but also to tackle the problem of pollution. It's worth pointing out that right around that time, 1972, the U.S. Congress passed the Clean Water Act, which is one of the most aspirational pieces of federal legislation in the history of the United States. And that gave organizations like Save the Bay the legal remedies, the legal tools to fight water pollution.
But the act itself wasn't enough to change Narragansett Bay.
No, not at all. The act created a legal framework, but what was required was enforcing the law and funding to remediate, to address pollution problems, particularly from the public
by funding
sector.
you mean
Money.
local funding in large part, or no?
Well, in large part at that time, the federal government stepped in after the passage of the Clean Water Act in the late 70s and into the 80s with large appropriations to go to the states to clean up water pollution problems among public entities, particularly public wastewater. So the water that funded the Narragansett Bay Commission, the Warwick Treatment Plant, there are 38 different wastewater treatment plants that discharge into the bay. Much of the money that went to build those plants came from the federal government. Now today, the federal government share of the contribution is much smaller. So the largesse of the federal government has diminished over time. But back in the day, that's what really funded
Why
a lot
has
of
it diminished?
It's
why?
Yes, well, it's diminished because the federal government has taken on lots of obligations, and wastewater is less important than it once was. Which, by the way, we're sort of jumping around here, but the Congress just passed a massive infrastructure bill, and a huge component of that is wastewater and drinking water treatment. So it's the first major investment in wastewater and drinking water treatment in decades
But
from the federal
some
government.
of that could go to places like Flint or
Of course,
people who've
yeah,
had that problem.
absolutely.
But
yeah.
so
anyway,
there was a time when I remember, and I've only lived here 35 years or so. If you'd come to the beach in Barrington on a Monday morning with the dog, there would be foam at the edge of the water. It was so obvious
Yeah.
that something
Yeah.
was wrong, and there were personal hygiene products. There were needles, and how did all that get there, and how was it happening? Why didn't people just not do it?
well, there was. Your recollection is the same as mine. I first arrived in Rhode Island in 1976, and I rowed at Brown University, and I was on the crew team, and so we were on the bay. Though that was many years ago, and the water was just as bad as you described. There was dead fish floating. There was human waste from sewage treatment overflows. Mm-hmm. There was lots of other pollutant, a lot of other pollution, and it was a combination of discharges from big pipes, think wastewater treatment plants, industrial facilities. It was runoff off city streets, poor waste management. All these factors contributed to the pollution that you saw.
Right, and if you would walk along the bay, and they're still there, they would say wastewater outlet number 16 or
right.
something like that. And they were these, and they're still there.
Right.
These big pipes. We'll get to the remedy, but so what were they doing there? Where did they come from? Those big.
Yeah, it's really interesting if you look at the history of wastewater treatment of human waste in the United States. The state-of-the-art technology was to combine runoff from city streets and discharges from toilets from homes, apartment buildings into one system because it was more efficient to actually combine the runoff, which collected horse manure before cars,
right.
and human waste, and treat them in one plant. So from an efficiency point of view, it made sense. You collect the horse waste, you collect the human waste, you treat it in one plant. And that's what the Providence system was built on. It was built on a combined sewer overflow system. And the word overflow comes into play when it rains a lot. Of course, the rain hits city streets, flows into the treatment plant, and floods the plant. And that's the pipes, those discharge pipes you're mentioning.
And what's
are the
wrong
overflow.
with flooding? What's wrong with flooding the plant? May I ask an obvious question?
Sure. Well, when you flood the plant, you can't treat the water, and you can't handle the volume. So there is basically a escape valve for that extra water, which is carrying human waste and debris off the city streets, and releases it to the bay so that the plant is not overwhelmed. And so the solution to that's called a combined sewer overflow system.
Right.
Providence has one.
Yeah.
Newport has one.
Yeah.
Fall River has one.
Yeah.
The three largest cities that discharge into the bay. So whenever it rains, prior to the 90s,
Right.
You'd have these major overflow events which would discharge raw sewage into the bay.
Now the solution is an amazing story, I think, and we'll get to it. But one of the things I just wanted to touch on before we end this first section of the days of the horrors was something that echo theater, we might call it, where you would have the day's catch, and Save the Bay was sort of involved in this, and you put a tarp out in front of the State House, and then what would you do?
Well, we had a big campaign in the 80s to help the legislature understand what was coming out of those pipes.
The story that I was talking about, walking on the beach, that you
Yeah.
saw on
Yeah.
the boats.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So whenever it rained, we would have staff people with fishing nets, minnow nets, stand outside of those discharge pipes and gather what came out of the pipe. And then we took those to the State House. And the legislators were appalled, as anyone would be, to actually be confronted with what was coming off the city streets and discharging straight into Narragansett Bay.
Right.
And that helped with a couple of major decisions that the legislature made, one of which was to create the Narragansett Bay Commission and take control of the Providence wastewater treatment system from the city of Providence and put it into this quasi-public agency, which is a world-class agency and has done a great job at cleaning up the water.
Right, right. And what you wouldn't see, of course, is the heavy metal and the muck and all that, right?
Sure.
And is that still down there, sitting at the bottom of all the rivers in all the bay?
Well, it's a lot of it is, if you think about the early industrial age in the U.S. in Narragansett Bay, we have Slater Mill and we have all the mills that line the Patuxent River and the Blackstone River, even the Taunton River. You know, industries like tanneries, jewelry trades, they discharged a lot. Electroplating, a lot of heavy metals, and those metals sink to the bottom. There are a lot of heavy metals buried in the sediment. As long as they stay there, they don't create a public health hazard. So it's probably better to leave alone than try and remove them, which would disturb all that sediment and put it back into the water column where it could harm people.
Well, I think we're at the end of our first section, right?
We are at the end of the first segment of the Tommy Rocket Show. Please stay tuned with Jonathan Stone and Peter Phipps after these messages.
Cruelty is not fashionable.
Don't wear fur.
Support the people who fight for animal rights.
Hi, and welcome back to the second segment of the Tommy Rocket Show. As you know, we're here with Jonathan Stone from Save the Bay and Peter Phipps, my co-host. Peter, where are we at this interview?
Well, we're in a mid-90s or something, and we're solving the problem. And so we know the problem is that if it rains, everything went out in the bay and it was awful. So do you build a bigger sewage treatment plant? Do you replace all the sewers? What do you do here?
Well, the solution is a simple solution, really, when you think about it. The solution to these combined sewer overflows is to build underground storage to capture runoff in a rain event and hold it. Think of it as a big holding tank underground so that the treatment plant eventually can catch up and process the water. Once the rain event has passed, the storm has passed, this first flush, all that polluted runoff off the city streets and the wastewater from homes is captured in a giant underground tunnel under the streets of Providence and held there until the treatment plant at Fields Point can process that water.
So describe this tunnel.
Between downtown Providence and Fields Point, where the Narragansett Bay Commission treatment plant is located.
Where underneath the State House, or no? Does it get that far?
It's not quite up to the State House, but close to it.
Right.
It's a 3-mile tunnel, and I believe it's 30 feet in diameter. So that's a big tunnel.
How far underground is it?
It's 300 feet underground, and it is sloped downhill underground from Providence toward Fields Point. So it fills up with this runoff and sits there until the treatment plant can process the water, pump it out. They pump it up into the plant, and then the clean water is discharged to the bay.
And it's just a hole cut in the rock.
Yeah, it's a big giant tube.
You can't imagine how they got that far under the ground to create it.
Well, that's a
whole
why don't you
other.
Explain the engineering briefly.
So the engineering is you drop a shaft, you dig a shaft down.
With a bore, right?
Well, you dig it down with machinery.
Yeah.
And then you lower a boring machine, which is a big rotary, basically
like
set
a
of blades,
machine, right?
Like a rotor-rooter, and that actually travels through the rock. It drills through the rock like a giant drill, and the rubble that you've drilled out is lifted up the shaft and trucked elsewhere. So you remove the rock in that fashion, and the machine, I believe I'm correct in this, the machine that dug the tunnel was the same machine that dug the tunnel between France and Great Britain.
Wow.
Really?
The tunnel. And
That's impressive.
it was a huge project, and it's quite a feat of engineering.
When did they do this? What year?
Well, the project started in the early 2000s, the construction, 2004. It was completed in 2008.
And the cost was $1 billion or $900 million?
The cost was, well, again, there's dollars spent then, but the cost was something like $500 or $600 million.
And it
for
was
that
ratepayers paid
phase.
for this entirely, or was there federal, state
There
money
was
involved?
federal money and ratepayer money, and some state money.
Ratepayer means it's
So the
written into my
ratepayers-
bill if you're the
Right.
Narragansett Bay Commission
All of
customer.
the Narragansett Bay Commission customers who use the treatment facility and pay a sewage fee paid back the borrowed money that the state provided, and the federal government chipped in grant money that helped lower the overall cost.
So that's phase one.
Yes.
And you don't just build a river underground, you have to connect it, right?
So phase two, thank you, Peter. Phase two was a project that built large collection pipes that connected the storm drains around the main body of the city of Providence, the west side of Providence downtown, and connected those storm drains to the big pipe. And so that was phase two, and that was completed in 2014, I believe.
And how much did that cost?
That was another, I don't know, don't hold me to this. The numbers are all available on the Narragansett Bay
A couple
Commission.
$100 million, right,
It's
at least?
a couple $100 million,
Now-
300 million, I think, something like that.
And it was estimated, if I remember reading, that took 85% of the pollutants, dealt with 85% of the pollutants in the upper
Not
bay?
quite. Those two phases capture about 65% of the water treated by the Bay Commission. So 65% of the service area for the Narragansett Bay Commission. The other 35 or 40% is in Pawtucket, East Providence, Central Falls, a little bit of Lincoln.
Right.
And that's treated by another plant over in East Providence called the Buckland Point plant.
Right. Now that's phase three, right?
Phase three.
Right.
So phase three just started. That is the most expensive phase. It's 600 or 700 million to complete that phase. That is another tunnel. It's a little bit smaller and a little bit shorter and a little bit less deep. It's about 200 feet underground, I believe. And that will essentially be another big storage facility to feed into the Buckland Point plant. And that runs up underneath Pawtucket. So that will capture the overflows, the runoff, and the sewage from the Central Falls,
Now,
Pawtucket area.
There's one more part of this, I suppose, is that in a place like Warwick, you had to put sewers to replace their septic systems, right? And that's happening like little by little all the time, or are they still resisting that?
Well, okay, so Warwick is interesting. Warwick, of course, developed in a very in a way where sewering was not envisioned initially. It was a series of villages that were built up around Greenwich Bay. And most of those properties were on septic systems or cesspools, even worse. Over the last 30, 40 years, the city has gradually been sewering different neighborhoods. There has been opposition to sewering, in part because it's expensive. However, the environmental benefits far exceed the cost over time of the sewering. And the water quality, the treatment level, the degree to which you can protect the bay and clean up water is enhanced by sewering versus septic. And of course, cesspools are basically holes in the ground where you put raw sewage. They're the worst. So there has been resistance, and we understand that. And there's
Resistance by the residents or the?
by residents who have to pay a tie-in fee. And yes, it's been a controversial issue.
And the tie-in fee for a home might be $5,000-6,000 more.
Right, I think it's $8,000, but again, it's spread over 30 or 40 years. So your sewer bill, your
can
monthly
amortize
sewer
it.
bill, it's
Right.
amortized, is up by a couple of
Right.
dollars. So the number sounds big, but when you amortize it over a long period of time, which you should,
Right.
It's a de minimis
Now,
amount.
for all these things, we see aquaculture booming like never before. Places, talk about Warwick, Oakland Beach, I don't think closes as much as
Correct,
it
yeah,
used to.
yeah.
And there's talk about what you can do in the Upper Bay. And then there's your favorite canary in the mine shaft, a greasy little fish called the Menhaden, which you're a
Well, I
fan
don't think
of.
you should describe it that way. I
Greasy?
love the
Is it
Menhaden.
greasy?
You don't eat it,
No, I don't. I don't.
and it is greasy.
That's true. It's true.
And it swims in maddening circles, no?
Well, so the Menhaden, for your viewers who aren't familiar with the Menhaden, Peter's absolutely right, is a little silvery fish about this big. Adult Menhaden be about this big.
Like a flatfish?
It's a fin fish. It's a filter feeder. It looks a little bit like a herring, a little wider. And the Menhaden is very interesting. It's often called the most important fish in the sea for two main reasons. One is that it feeds on plankton. It removes plankton, plant matter from the ocean.
Why is that bad, plankton?
Well, if you have too much of it, you know what your swimming pool looks like when you leave the water in it and you don't filter it? It gets green, pretty unattractive. Nothing can live in there.
Right.
That's what the bay would be like if you had too much plankton.
Right.
And why would you have too much plankton? Well, one reason you might have too much plankton is nutrients. Nitrogen is a fertilizer, and in the bay, nitrogen fertilizes plankton growth. So if you have too much nitrogen, you get too much plankton. So one solution to that problem is what we just talked about, the CSO, which channels water through the treatment plants that remove nitrogen. Another solution is to encourage filter feeders that feed on plankton, like Menhaden, oysters, mussels, they all feed on quahogs, they all feed on plankton. And the Menhaden converts plankton into, to grow and get big. So that's a good thing. And the second good thing is that everybody in the sea loves to eat Menhaden. If you're a striped bass, you're a bluefish, you're a whale, you're a dolphin, you're a tuna, everybody likes to eat Menhaden. I think of Menhaden as sort of the bacon of the sea.
For the
rest of them. Let's not forget about osprey, which feed almost exclusively on Menhaden.
Really?
Yes. And there are other interesting things about Menhaden and their role in the ecosystem. For example, bluefish are known for very aggressive fish. They will cut through a school of Menhaden and they'll take bites out of Menhaden. They won't even eat the fish.
Right,
They'll just chop it up.
It's something to see, and it's like
Yes.
clapping, like there's clapping going on
Correct.
in the water.
So the bluefish will cut through a school of Menhaden, and the chunks of Menhaden that they've left behind fall to the bottom. And guess who eats that? Crabs, flounder, all kinds of bottom feeders. So Menhaden really is one of those essential species upon which many other species that we really do value, like striped bass, that feed upon them.
Now,
So-
how would you say the Menhaden population is today?
Well, it's first of all, the Menhaden population is a seasonal visitor to Narragansett Bay. The
Right.
Menhaden population spawns off the mid-Atlantic coast and in beds way offshore in the Gulf Stream. And the little baby fish are brought in by currents into the estuaries in the mid-Atlantic, Chesapeake Bay principally, Delaware Bay, Hudson River. And the animals they're filter feeders again, and they grow into about this big, size we call them bunker, or pogies. And these little guys that are this big, they swim up the shore in the spring, and they arrive here in Narragansett Bay in May. And for example,
They're coming.
they're coming. And so to answer this is a long-winded way to answer your question. The populations that we see here in Narragansett Bay vary quite a bit depending on what happens
In other
down the
places.
coast.
Yes, I see.
Whatever happens down there. Are they overfished? Or does the Gulf Stream not come in as close to shore, so they have a little more difficulty landing here in Narragansett Bay? There are a variety of different factors that influence how many we see every year, but they do come every year. And the fishery that we all value in Rhode Island depends on Menhaden,
Right.
bluefish, striped bass, these other species.
And I should just say is that if you're lucky and you see them, they come up the river all the way to the bridges in downtown Providence, and you can see these maniacal animals, thousands of them. They swim around and around in
And they
circles.
eat the plankton.
Right, so its evolution is really an amazing concept. The Menhaden have evolved to swim on the surface in dense schools, which if you're a filter feeder, imagine a vacuum cleaner. It's like a giant vacuum cleaner working together. The whole school of fish actually behaves as a vacuum cleaner.
As an organism in its own.
As an organism in its own. The school swims collectively and they scoop up, swallow, filter all this water and consume the plankton.
Wow. Well, that's a very interesting way to end the second segment of the Tommy Rocket Show. So stay tuned, and we'll be back with Peter and Jonathan for the third segment. So stay tuned for these messages.
Hi, I'm Alec Baldwin with People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. Like most people, I grew up loving circuses and other traveling animal shows, but it never occurred to me what life might be like for the animals. Open your mind and your heart and consider the plight of these performers who did not choose to be in the entertainment business. Don't patronize animal acts. For further information, please contact People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals.
Hi, and welcome back to the third segment of the Tommy Rocket Show. Peter, where are we in this interview?
Well,
What were we discussing?
we're about to move from the past to the future.
Yes.
And the future is a story about climate change. A couple disturbing new reports have come out from NOAA saying that seas could rise in the Northeast. Worst case is something like 16 inches by 2050, and certainly by a foot. Are you engaged in this issue?
Absolutely. I think what your viewers would appreciate knowing is that the climate's been changing at an accelerating pace due to human impacts. That's a well-known fact. And we see it every day in the changing ecology of Narragansett Bay. Narragansett Bay and the watershed that surrounds it, the landscape around it, is affected by changing climate conditions, and you can see it in a number of different ways. One is that the seas are rising, and that's the issue you just raised. And NOAA's study is another wake-up call about the pace of sea level rise.
Well, let's look at that pace,
Yeah,
for example.
sure.
I think one of the things they said is since one marker, I've seen a marker of 1930 to present, it's 9 inches.
Right.
And now to 2050 could be 16 or 20 inches.
In 30 years, roughly.
Right. So we
right.
talk 70 years versus 30 years. That's what you mean by accelerated.
That's right. Actually, it was 9 inches over 100 years.
Oh, 100 years, okay.
And in the next 30 years, expected to rise anywhere from 8 to 16 inches, depending on where you are on the East Coast.
Another 8 to 16
Yes.
inches.
And where do you see that 10 inches? Oh, that's not bad, 10 inches.
Well, it's interesting. What you have to think about is, first of all, a lot of infrastructure around Narragansett Bay is built right on the water. We're a coastal state, and it's really not that far off the water. You think about Ocean Ave in Newport. It's only, 3 or 4 feet above high water level, high tide, a normal high tide. And we have roads in Warwick. You mentioned Oakland Beach. Oakland Beach is right at sea level, or a few feet above. So 10 or 12 inches may not sound like a lot, but when you think about that degree of rise and a storm, you combine higher sea levels with storms that create storm surges. That 12 inches becomes 2 feet, 3 feet of extra storm surge.
Hurricane of 38.
So the water, it builds up, it piles
That's
up, in other
even
words. If you think
the most
about,
extreme
exactly.
case.
So if you think about climate change is this complex interaction of different factors that take what sounds like a modest amount of higher sea level and makes it much worse, because our storms, as we I think have all observed in the last 30 years, are becoming more intense. So you have more intense storms that push more water up on the shore in the case of a storm surge, and you have other flooding effects that are related to climate change. But in terms of sea level rise, that's one of the things you're concerned about, is not just the rise in sea levels in the region, but how that interacts with storms and waves that create even more flooding damage.
And erode the land away from...
Erosion, for example, in the South Coast, you think about South County in Rhode Island between Westerly and Point Judith is a very sandy shoreline, and the rate of erosion is accelerating because sea levels are rising, storms are becoming more intense, and the sand is being pulled offshore.
You ever been to the bar, the Ocean Mist?
I have, yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
well, it's a very nice place, but it is sitting on piers, and the beach there is gone. What's the name of the beach there? It's completely almost...
Matunic.
Matunac's almost gone there at that point. And it sits right over the water, and the surfers are... And
I was there recently.
And the water crashes underneath, and you hear the little stones. And the waiters there once had a thing, don't worry, our piers are sucked down so deep the devil won't let them loose, or something like that. But that's... a place like the Ocean Mist is at risk, correct, in this scenario?
Well, it is, and it's important to remember that at the end of the day, the sea will win. Humans have never been good at preventing the seas from rising. So, I think the way we think about the problem is how do we best adapt? And as an environmental organization, we're concerned not only about human populations and communities of people who live on the water and how we adapt our infrastructure, our roads, our bridges, our utilities, how do we adapt? But the natural world has to adapt too, because think about it, salt marshes, for example, which line the shore of Narragansett Bay, are nurseries for fish. And if the seas rise too rapidly, those nurseries will themselves die off, and that means fewer fish. So, for example, one of the things we've been spending the last 25 years doing is working on projects that allow marshes to migrate more readily, to keep up with sea level rise.
So how do you do that when private property intervenes?
Well, there are areas where you can and areas where you can't. If you have a salt marsh up against a seawall or a road, then the marsh can't move past it. But if you have a salt marsh against a farmer's field or an undeveloped stretch of coast, then the marsh will be able to migrate.
Can you give us an example where you've succeeded in
sure.
this?
A great example would be Round Marsh in Jamestown. Mm-hmm. So as you drive across Jamestown from north to south, you will drive over a low-lying area which is called Round Marsh.
Which is on the northern end of the island?
It's actually right in the middle of the island. There's a low point right between the north and the south end of the island.
Before you get to the bridges?
Correct.
Yeah.
And Round Marsh is actually migrating onto a farmer's field that's in conservation. And the marsh will naturally do that if it has a place to go.
Right.
So we've been working on that particular site to restore the marsh to health, ensure water doesn't get impounded on top of the marsh, which can damage the marsh,
so
and allow it to
flowing in
migrate.
and out with the tides, that's
Correct.
important, right?
Right. Make sure the water does not sit on top of the marsh, and allow land for the marsh to naturally migrate, because the plant communities on the marsh will naturally seed into higher and higher elevations as sea levels rise. So that's one example. We've done another great project up in the Taunton River, which is one of the major rivers that enters in Narragansett Bay, in the town of Dighton. Same thing. We have a marsh and a farmer's field next to it, and the local conservation commission has established a conservation easement on that farmer's field to allow the marsh to migrate inland as sea levels rise. Now, you can't do that everywhere, but it's important we preserve as much of that as possible.
So in those conservation areas, the farmer sold the development rights or something like that?
Yes,
or?
yeah, in that particular case, the farmer sold the development rights and was willing to give up some of his property so that over time the marsh has a place to migrate.
Right.
So that's one example of...
now let me ask you this.
Yeah.
How many marshes are on your endangered list? I mean, what marshes are you worried about right now?
We're worried about all the marshes in Narragansett Bay. And the challenge we have in Narragansett Bay is if you think about further down the East Coast, say Maryland, Chesapeake Bay, lots of marsh, but a very low-lying landscape, very flat, very low-lying. Narragansett Bay, most of the shoreline is rock. Mm-hmm. We have more in common with Maine than we do with Chesapeake, with Maryland and Virginia. And that's a problem because the marsh doesn't really have any place to go. So we have identified areas where we feel we should prioritize for marsh restoration, marsh adaptation, because there is landscape for the marsh to migrate to.
Right.
We have to preserve as much as possible.
And do you get bond issues for that on occasion?
We get not so much bond issues. The state has been supportive in some ways. The federal government also has programs that are designed to support marsh fishery habitat protection. NOAA, for example, you mentioned NOAA. NOAA has grant programs that are designed to help restoration practitioners restore marsh and protect marsh from sea level rise.
So can you do the opposite? Can you fill in and make a marsh moving out into the water, or raise up the marsh by fill?
You could. There's sort of one of the red lines for Save the Bay in the world of conservation is we don't like people filling the bay. The bay's already been filled too much. So as a practical matter, you don't want to fill the bay, but you do want to conserve those natural areas along the coast where marshes can form naturally.
Right.
That's the goal.
So, so what are we worried about 10 years, 50 years in the bay itself? I mean, what are things that are worrisome?
Well, you know, one of the things that we care a lot about, that we're concerned about, is water quality. And we talked earlier in the program about the importance of treating wastewater and removing nutrients from water. And as temperatures rise, the ecology of the bay, water temperatures rise. Think of it as a greenhouse. If you try and grow plants in a greenhouse that's warm, they grow faster. And as the bay warms, plankton will grow faster. And that raises sort of the burden on us to reduce these nitrogen loads, reduce the nutrient loads to prevent this problem of too much.
Take at least the food away from that environment.
Exactly.
Okay.
So that's one aspect. Another issue is what we're seeing now with storm events is more intense rainfalls. And those rain events wash pollutants off the landscape. So that's a problem that we call stormwater, runoff that carries pollution off the landscape into the bay. So we're concerned about that, and the solution to that is to capture that runoff in different ways, not big underground tunnels, but in what are called, the fancy term would be green infrastructure, but for the rest of us, it's things like rain gardens, it's things like swales that capture runoff and allow the land to filter the water naturally, allow the water to seep back into the land.
Like, for example, a parking lot that's stripped with gravel strips, for example.
Sure. A good example is actually a town beach in Bristol, big parking lot.
The town beach in Bristol.
Yeah.
And the town beach is in Colt State Park above the beach, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Town beach in Bristol, they did a great job some years back, 15 years ago or so, of putting in these infiltration sites around the parking lot. So when it rained, the water would run into these areas and be absorbed into the soils naturally.
They dig a hole, they put some rock in the hole, and
they planted it with plants and flowers. It's beautiful. It's actually quite spectacular. But that's something else we're concerned about, is capturing and treating stormwater.
Right. Now those are all little things, but but you know, you hear this thing about are there lobsters left? You talk about water temperature. Lobsters are moving north. Is there anything you can do about that? I mean, I suppose other species will come in as the lobsters go out or something?
So remember, lobster are a cold water species, and as the water warms, they're not so happy.
They're heading north.
Well, they're headed north or they're headed deep. So there are lobstermen who fish in this part of southern New England, but they're going way offshore. They're going into deep water.
Like what's deep water?
150 feet, 200 feet.
Their traps are down 150 feet.
So that is not your mom and pop's lobster boat on the bay.
No.
The lobster are gone from the bay.
Crank on the back. Yeah.
Right. But another example of it, to your point, is I think local fishermen will tell you all about this. We see more and more black sea bass, which is a sport fish, and they didn't used to be very prevalent here. Now they're everywhere. And that's because waters are warming.
Right.
So they're moving, shifting.
You lose one, you gain one.
You lose one, you gain one. Soon we'll have blue crabs, and we can have blue crab for dinner.
Like Narragansett, like Chesapeake Bay.
There you
we'll
go.
Get hammers
there you go.
and bang them.
Yep.
All right.
Wow. Well, we're come to the conclusion of the third segment, and as I said before, stay tuned to these messages, and we'll be back with the fourth segment of the Tommy Rocket Show, so stay tuned. Hi, and welcome back to the fourth and final segment of the Tommy Rocket Show. We're here with Peter and Jonathan Stone. Peter, where have we come to in the interview?
Well, we've defined the problem, and now we're going to work on this solution here in 15 minutes. We can do it.
We can do that.
So,
we can save the bay.
Right. The General Assembly in July passed this Act on Climate Change Act, or I don't know if there are two acts or not, but what did you think of that? I think Save the Bay institutionally supported it.
Absolutely.
It's looking to a net zero 2050, and it's trying to seems to be addressing the issue. Do you agree, or?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think it's really important that people understand that the problem of climate change is based on burning of fossil fuels. And so anything we can do to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels is beneficial to the environment. So the Act on Climate bill sets forward a series of goals for the state to reduce its dependence on fossil fuels. You think about fossil fuels, we use fossil fuels in heating, our homes, our businesses. We use them for transportation, and we use them for electricity.
And we make plastic.
And we'll talk about plastic in a minute. So it's critical that the state of Rhode Island do its part, the residents of the state of Rhode Island, we do our part to reduce consumption of fossil fuels. And we can do that by energy conservation, insulating our homes. We can do that by converting our vehicles from older gas-guzzling cars and trucks to electric vehicles. We can do that by building renewable energy infrastructure.
But you're not sold on solar in Rhode Island, are you?
Well, I think solar, I would say this about all energy, properly sited matters. Putting things where they belong matters. What you don't want to do is create unintended negative consequences to energy infrastructure, whether it's solar. So for example, in Rhode Island, we have state incentives that are really promoting and driving the construction of solar farms, which is important. We want to generate more electricity through renewable sources like solar and wind. The problem lies in where you put the solar farms. Forests are incredibly important to the resilience of our world and the natural world to the effects of climate change.
Because
and
of
in fact,
carbon and cooling and
water supplies, drinking water, habitat, biodiversity, and sequestering carbon. So to cut down a forest, to put a large
Solar farm.
solar farm is counterproductive. It's
and one
not
could say putting a vacant field that's no longer productive for agriculture and not letting it return to a forest might be
counterproductive as well. However, we have parking lots, we have landfills, we have large areas of the state which are already developed, and where there are opportunities to put large solar installations in already developed areas. And that would be our prescription, that would be our recommendation, is to concentrate the development of solar in areas that are already disturbed by human activities.
Right. So
like
people,
for example, the interstates that come through the state. There's a lot of real estate in the cloverleafs and between the medians of interstates where you could put solar farms. Massachusetts does that all over the place.
Oh, I've never seen that.
And why not? I mean, it's already disturbed. So our recommendation would be to think very carefully about siting issues when it comes to renewable energy, whether it's wind or solar. It doesn't mean that we're not suggesting that it isn't absolutely urgent that we invest in renewable energy. That is crucial, and that's what the Act on Climate bill does. So that's really an important step the state is taking to promote renewable energy, and we support it fully.
So that's a policy decision that was made by the state to commit to that goal. What other policy decisions would you, if you could write them off and direct the legislature, what else would you have them do?
Well, I think there are two sides to the climate change coin. There's greenhouse gas mitigation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and there's preparing for what's coming. That's called adaptation. And we're at Save the Bay focused on both. We care a lot about greenhouse gas mitigation. We also care a lot about adaptation. How do we as a society and as an environmental advocate, how do we advocate for adaptation measures that protect the natural world, that provides us water, food, good health. How do we adapt to these changing climate conditions? So we have a bill before the legislature this year that we're supporting that provides funding for climate adaptation investments.
Like?
Well, there are two basic categories. There's the built world, infrastructure, protecting wastewater treatment plants from rising sea levels. We talked about rising sea levels. Treatment plants are built near the water because they release water into the bay or into a river.
Right.
So they tend to be prone to flooding. So just hardening walls around infrastructure, around wastewater treatment plants to protect them from being overwhelmed from floodwaters.
Sandy, for example.
Yes, Hurricane Sandy was a great example of the
it?
Warwick treatment plant.
Right.
That's
the Tuxet River there. It was
exactly
done, right?
Exactly. So that's one example. That's a built. Another one would be in urban areas where you have roads that are subject to flooding, raise the roads. Good idea. You have to do that to adapt to flooding, both from from ocean storms and from rain events. But there's the whole natural world as well. We've talked about one of the great examples, which is helping salt marshes migrate. We talked about a second example, which is capturing rainwater and allowing it to filter naturally into the earth.
Bristoltown Beach example.
Exactly, Bristoltown Beach. So another example would be, and Warwick's a great example of this. Warwick is low-lying. There are roads in Warwick that are regularly underwater from normal tides, not even storms. And if those roads don't serve a purpose, they don't serve a community, then get rid of the roads.
Right.
So carve back infrastructure, remove infrastructure. That's another path you can take. So these are all steps that we think should be supported by the state. The federal government has money to provide resources to address these problems, but the state has to provide a match. So we have legislation at the State House now to develop a funding source to fund adaptation and resilience projects.
And you're going to push that bill in the coming
We are.
years?
We had good success last year in creating a funding vehicle called the Ocean State Climate Adaptation and Resilience Fund, OSCAR.
You just got to get some money in
The
it. Right?
OSCAR fund, and now we're working on the funding mechanism. How do we fund it?
I see. Good. So, so those are all big things. What can everyday citizens who are worried about these things do? I mean, what?
Yeah,
To throw up their hands, or?
What I like to say is there are a million things you can do. There are lots of things you can do in a variety of different ways. The first is live a bay-friendly life. And it's simple things, like if you have a pet, a dog or a cat, clean up after your pet. You would not believe how important that is. It's incredibly important. Pet waste is represents a serious pollution problem.
On the street, it gets in the
washes a rain
in the
event.
gutter?
Rain event washes down the storm drain, and guess where it ends up? In the bay.
Yeah.
Another thing is, this is sort of an interesting little thing, but I'm sure a lot of your viewers have seen flocks of Canada geese on golf courses and city parks, and they're eating the
And
roots,
they leave behind
trails of poo.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
So Canada geese also poop a lot, and their poop is not good for the bay.
No.
So how do you get rid of Canada geese? Well, there's one simple way, which is letting your grass grow. So if you have a big lawn at your house, say you have a big lawn,
Right.
and if you allow normal summer grasses to grow above, you don't mow it, but you allow the grasses to grow, and you plant in species that grow taller.
Right.
If the grass gets about this high,
Right.
18 inches,
Yeah.
you won't have any geese anymore.
Why not?
Because the geese are afraid of predators. They don't like being near long grass.
Really?
They're afraid of foxes and coyotes. So if you devote more of your lawn to these beautiful long grasses and wildflowers,
As opposed to a golf course, for
as
example.
opposed to a kind of a manicured lawn,
Right.
you'll get rid of your goose problem. That's good too.
Right.
Then there are other things you can do. We talked in the between segments about plastics and plastic pollution.
Yeah.
Just be conscious about how much plastic you're consuming, and try and avoid single-use plastics.
Yeah.
Single-use plastics either get recycled or end up in the landfill, and often they end up in the bay.
Yeah.
So that's another action
I've
that
been
people can
to
take.
places in the world where there's so much plastic, you think it's the beach. There's so much plastic.
Right.
It's horrible.
We have legislation that we're advocating for up at the General Assembly this year one is a plastic bottle deposit bill, and the other is called an extended producer responsibility bill.
Like a manifest. Huh?
That requires the bottlers and the plastic bottle producers to be responsible for what happens to their product after the liquid is consumed.
You'll get the lobbyists' attention with that.
We will, and we have.
So now what about how about I want to volunteer, I want to do something. Is there anything I can do?
Well, there's, I appreciate the question. At Save the Bay, we are a grassroots organization. We depend on thousands of people to support our work and to get involved in a variety of different ways. And so we have ample volunteer opportunities.
Memberships.
Membership, of course, is crucial because if you become a member of Save the Bay, we'll tell you what's up. We'll give you opportunities. We'll highlight opportunities for you to volunteer. And on our website, which is www.savebay.org, if you go to our website, you'll see a whole section around volunteer opportunities. And that includes things like shoreline cleanups, marsh restoration projects, volunteering at events for Save the Bay. So we have lots of ways people can volunteer.
And how many people are members today?
So we have about 20,000 households that regularly receive information and participate in our programs.
And how does that compare to 30 years ago?
It's grown. It's grown a little bit faster than the population, which has not grown much.
Right.
So one of our challenges in life as an organization is to reach out and connect to people and help them understand how they can make a difference in the work that we do.
Well, I hope we can help you do that.
Through
this exposure.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. It really is, I really am grateful.
On that link, they can also find out how they can become members, join.
Yes. Go to our website, and there's information about how to become a member.
And they can come visit you, right? It's almost like a museum, your place, right?
Well, I wouldn't call it a museum. We're a little more busy than that. But yes. And also, I should mention, we have an aquarium in Newport at Easton's Beach, which is open year-round.
Right.
This time of year, it's open on weekends, and in the summer, it's open. And that's really a fun, exciting place. We have summer camps.
Is that in the new pavilion there?
It's right at First Beach, Easton's Beach.
Yeah.
All right.
That's pretty nice to know. That's pretty nice to know. So, Peter, do you have any closing comments for our guest here? We have 30 seconds approximately. Can only thank you so much for coming.
I thought it was great, and I thought the science was good for what we did. We could spend more time talking about science, but what are you going to do?
Do you want to talk about Menhaden a little bit more?
No, I would.
Okay.
I think that people don't realize that those Menhadens exist, and I think that was a great piece of information to educate people, especially about the Bay. And the Bay is very important. It actually divides the state. It's one of the things that makes Rhode Island one of the most geographically interesting things. About New England, not many states are divided by water like we are, and I think it's important to know as much as we can about something we have such a close relationship with. And I can only thank you once again, Mr. Stone. Peter, thank you so much for being such a good co-host. And thank you, the state of Rhode Island, for watching the Tommy Rocket Show. Stay tuned, and you'll be glad you did.